Well, thanks for having me. Indeed, the book produced a collaboration now. We've joined forces to talk about, to try to make sense of what has been happening in Ukraine in the area of judicial reform since EuroMaidan. Oh,
You're on PowerPoint, please.
sure. Sounds good. And so we've tried to go. We're focusing on the concept of judicial reform, since judicial reform is something that in Ukraine right now everybody talks about in positive terms. The politicians promise to implement it. Civil society says it's incredibly important. Regular people, when you ask them in polls, put judicial reform at the top of the agenda for necessary reforms. Even the judges who are getting reformed cannot actually be on the record as opposing judicial reform. So they say they support it as well. But we wanted to start with the question of what is actually judicial reform? What does it entail? And when you actually look at the comparative literature, we notice that there really isn't sort of a systematic conceptual framework about how to understand judicial reform. There's a lot of assumptions about how judicial reform is generally seen as a normatively desirable thing that perhaps will produce greater independence and greater power of the judiciary. So if it doesn't, if that doesn't obtain, so maybe that means that judicial reform was either not happening or unsuccessful. But in fact, we thought that it might be fruitful to just look at judicial reform in sort of normatively neutral terms, and think about this following conceptual framework for it. So now you can't see it, but hopefully you can follow. So the first part of this is that judicial reform can have very different scope. Obviously, there could be different types of initiatives reforming different parts of the judiciary. There are some reforms that get only at the Constitutional Court, other reforms that get only at the lower courts, or we can have a really comprehensive reform that gets at all of these component parts of the judiciary, including some of the institutions that sort of support the judiciary, but are very consequential to the way that it functions. Second, judicial reform can have very different forms. It can be done through legislative amendments. This is the most obvious way. You basically amend the laws that govern how the judiciary is set up and how it functions. But you can also go beyond that and have whole-scale institutional reform of the judiciary, which goes a bit further. Obviously, that takes place through new legislation, but by institutional reform, we mean reform in which existing institutions are reconstituted, or new institutions are introduced, or institutions are removed. Then there is judicial reform that can touch upon the informal way in which the judiciary functions, sort of the informal norms. Those are probably the hardest to change, but changing those may be as consequential, if not more consequential, than changing the institutional framework. And finally, a separate dimension of judicial reform is the impact that reform actually has, and not a broader impact on society. I don't mean that. That's more or less sort of the consequence, but impact on the way in which the judiciary functions. You can define reform in terms of what kind of impact has been achieved in terms of or has obtained, because I don't want to talk about judicial reform necessarily as an achievement, because it can be, in fact, normatively undesirable. Certain reforms can produce normatively undesirable impact, as anybody who followed judicial developments pre-EuroMaidan will remember the Yanukovych reform of the judiciary, which had the effect of reducing the power of the Supreme Court. So that was also judicial reform. Okay, so thinking with this conceptual framework in mind, we looked at what has actually happened in Ukraine in the area of judicial reform in the last 3 years. And first we see that there has been enormous legislative change. Or before I even get to that, in terms of the scope of reforms, Ukraine has had really comprehensive scope of judicial reforms. Basically, every single institution, every single level of the judiciary has been in some way affected by reforms. From the lowest courts up to the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court, and also all the institutions that are institutions of judicial self-government, which also are very consequential to how the judiciary functions. So reform has touched every single one of those. And in terms of legislative, in terms of the form of judicial reform, legislative changes have been comprehensive as well. So you are going to see a list of all the laws that have been passed in the last 3 years on the judiciary, starting with the law on restoring trust in the judiciary, which was passed almost immediately after Yanukovych left Ukraine. By early April of 2014, we had this new law that basically fired all the existing administrative leaders within the judiciary, all the members of all the court chairs at all levels of the judiciary, and instituted elections through direct elections by the rank and file judges of their administrative leaders. So it started, judicial reform started with this big legislative initiative. In February 2015, we have a law on guaranteeing the right to a fair court. Then in June of 2016, there were constitutional amendments passed that also had enormous reach for restructuring the judiciary. In January 2017, there was another major law that reorganized and strengthened the Supreme Judicial Council. In July of 2017, we have legislation changing the Constitutional Court, a major change to the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court. Now, as of the summer of this year, Ukraine has instituted the institution of a constitutional complaint, which means that regular citizens can now access the court. This, in the comparative judicial politics literature, is seen as a huge expansion of jurisdiction. And in October of 2017, there were major revisions passed to the commercial, civil, and administrative and criminal codes. So basically, the legislative basis of the entire country has been amended very majorly. So in terms of legislative changes, there have been a lot of them. In terms of institutional changes as well, there has been a reconfiguration of every single important institution within the judiciary: the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, the High Council of Justice, which in English it's kind of hard to figure out how to talk about the new High Council of Justice, whether to use, because it translates to roughly the same. Высшая Рада Юстиции became Высшая Рада Правосудия, but both High Judicial Council roughly translated. But it's a new reconstituted, reconfigured institution. There were also some new institutions created: the Public Integrity Council at the High Qualification Commission for Judges, some ad hoc commissions. There is a new anti-corruption court in the works. There has been a new council for the judiciary created at the presidential administration, and in the related area of anti-corruption, which is ultimately something that the judiciary will have to deal with, there has been also a lot of institutional creation. We have the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, NABU. We have the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecution, which is within the prosecution, and we have the National Agency for Corruption Prevention within the executive. So, okay. So a ton of that's actually quite perfect, because I get to where I show you some results or some data. So, so a lot has been done in terms of formal changes, both institutional changes, both legislative and institutional changes. But here we get to the question of the impact of those changes on how the judiciary actually functions. And we see that there actually, for all the enormous scope and number of reforms, the impact has been more moderate. If we start with the very simple thing of turnover, given that all of these institutions were reconstituted, reconfigured, and judges were given the right to elect their new administrative leaders, did a lot of turnover actually take place at the judiciary? And there we see that the picture is definitely mixed. In fact, there has not been a lot of turnover. We see the results of the April 2014 court chair elections. So when judges were given the right to elect their administrative leaders, the chairs of their courts in a direct election, the vast majority of them re-elected their old chairs. You see some variation between the different types of courts, but statistical analysis actually shows that this is not significant variation. There's no difference in the re-election rate really when you look at the different types of courts, administrative courts, economic courts versus general courts. There's no difference between, there's no regional dimension to it. Basically, all over the country, judges re-elected about 80%, at an 80% level, more or less, they re-elected the same chairs. The only exception is that what I call proteges of the Yanukovych government were replaced at a significantly higher rate than everybody else. And what these proteges are, the way that I've defined who these people are, these are people who became chairs of the court immediately after they were appointed to the court. So in other words, they were parachuted to this court. So if they were parachuted to this chair position, that probably this happened since the president was in charge of that process. This happened with because they were proteges of the presidential administration. Now these people were replaced at a significantly higher rate, but still 60% of them were re-elected to their positions by the rank and file judges. So in fact, turnover has not been significant. Then you may say, well, this is only because this is April 2014, is very quick. Maybe people didn't think that this was a truly momentous change. It takes time. However, look at the candidates for the appointment to the new Supreme Court. So after these major changes, this summer, the High Qualification Commission of Judges and the High Judicial Council had to appoint members of the new reconstituted Supreme Court. Basically, the reform was that Yanukovych's reform, where he created high specialized courts in different areas and sort of gutted the previous Supreme Court, is being reversed, and they're going back to a big Supreme Court at the top of the judiciary. But you look at, so there was a competition for these positions. About 380 people applied for 120 positions. The High Qualification Commission of Judges selected 120 of those as winners of the competition and nominated them to the High Judicial Council. The High Judicial Council then had to submit those nominations to the president, who is still actually not, who has still not appointed these people. You look at the breakdown, and you see that the majority of the appointees who passed this this competition are former members of the Supreme Court. They were either former members of the specialized high court in their issue area, or members of the gutted, smaller Supreme Court. And there are actually very few newcomers. The biggest percentage of newcomers is in the commercial chamber. What you don't see is a lot of people a lot of judges from the lower echelons of the judiciary, from the lower courts, actually making it now as pro-reformist judges, making it onto the Supreme Court. You see that that's a tiny proportion of the nominees to the Supreme Court. So at this very basic level, in terms of turnover, there actually has not been a ton of it. I won't go into the change at the normative level, which at the informal norm level, which is harder to get at, and requires that I have more time than I have now. But I will briefly say, and I'm happy to discuss this in our discussion, that there has not been a lot of change to the informal norms in the judiciary either, and the dominant informal norm being in the Ukrainian judiciary over the duration of the post-communist period has been deference to the executive. That really seems to continue, and if you're interested in a 5-minute, really clear illustration of it, you should watch the YouTube videos uploaded by 2 pranksters who called 2 judges in Lviv who were in charge of hearing Saakashvili's cases. So the pranksters called them and introduced themselves as, the prankster introduced himself as a member of parliament who is perceived to be the point person in the Poroshenko team for the judiciary. And this presidential representative called the judge and said, well, the president is really interested in solving this case, you know, how? And the judge is more than eager to hear how the president wants the case solved. In fact, the judge actually says, so as I understand it, we're supposed to uphold this motion, right? Do I understand you correctly? Are we supposed to uphold this motion? The prankster has no idea what he's talking about, but says something like, the president thinks this is very important. And the judge confirms that this is now important for him as well. So I'll pass this off to Daniel to talk about the broader implications of this.